Hello and welcome back. This is the week 12 lecture. So we are nearing the end of the semester, of course, as we know. I think I mentioned before that this is sort of our last really sort of traditional lecture in the sense of how we've been doing them for most of the semester. I will be talking about the readings for this week, but really I want to focus a little bit more just on creative nonfiction in general, sort of as a genre, or if we don't necessarily see it as one genre, we can just sort of view it as a new mode of literature. A new way of delivering meaning. It's not brand new, as we're going to see. It's actually got a pretty long lineage, and we're going to locate the authors that we're reading this week within sort of a larger framework so we can better understand sort of just what creative nonfiction is, also how it functions today, how it differs maybe in certain ways from traditional literature, but also, of course, how it has a lot in common with older literary forms that we're already familiar with. So this is going to be sort of content-based, and it's sort of the last new material that we are really covering this semester. Next week will be my final lecture of the semester, and it's going to be different. It's going to be geared towards the final paper. So we're not going to be talking about anything in the book. I'm going to be talking about that final assignment and how I want you guys to kind of approach it and get started on it. I began talking a little bit about that last week, but we'll sort of pick up there in the final lecture, which will be Thanksgiving week next week. And then the final couple of weeks of class, you won't have lectures. We're just going to be working on our papers. So let's start with Hunter S. Thompson. But before we get into Thompson and also maybe Joan Didion, though I don't think I assigned her, I somehow skipped over her, but she comes right after Thompson in the book. So we might as well take a look at both because they're both examples of what we might think of as sort of practitioners of literary journalism. So I wanted to start here today. If we're thinking about creative nonfiction and kind of where it came from, a lot of scholars, a lot of critics will argue that, there is sort of a tradition. There's a long lineage of journalism and journalists who typically would have used a lot of literary techniques or strategies. They would have used maybe a style of language that we might expect to find in novels and short stories. So we've already been talking about some of the ideas that we're going to be working with today. A few weeks ago when we read Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King, we were talking about how, definitions of literature have expanded and how we can now consider a lot of different types of texts to be literature, or at least they are literary. They are similar to literature in a lot of ways. And this even kind of goes back to our conversation about genre fiction, just the idea that a lot of old-fashioned categories and divisions between different kinds of writing are increasingly going away, or they're just more flexible, or people are simply questioning them. So we have a kind of more expansive, a more inclusive conception now of what literature can be. But again, when a lot of literary scholars and critics and literary historians write about this, they often go back to the 19th century and they look at a handful of journalists who were practicing sort of an early form of what we might call creative nonfiction. But again, this is often labeled as literary journalism, and it still exists. It often will also, it can also carry the label of creative nonfiction, but that term didn't exist, in the 19th century. But journalism, of course, has been around about as long as novels have, right? So the kind of a part of the modern world. And I don't know if we got into this. I'm getting my lectures confused now. I think I was talking about this in my 451 class, but if you guys ever study newspapers a little bit more, or the history of newspapers, at least in this country and much of the Western world, you'll see that there really are a lot of interesting parallels between newspapers and novels. And this kind of gets us into a little bit of a new historicist critical approach, because really the two forms grew up together. And if you study a lot of early novels in the English language tradition, at least, you'll notice that they're often sort of taken from the headlines of newspapers. They're often very much based on real events, but the authors might change, the character names, and a few other details so they don't get sued for libel or something, But often there was a close interplay between the two forms. And of course, newspapers were supposed to be factual, nonfiction, and novels were expected to be fiction, but they used a lot of the same techniques. There was a lot of crossover, and a lot of writers would have practiced both styles. You would have had novelists who might have also worked at times as journalists, and you might have had, writers who started out as journalists and later published fiction. So when scholars talk about literary journalism back in the 19th century, they usually mention a few pretty big names like Stephen Crane, Mark Twain, Harriet Martineau, Rebecca Harding Davis. You're probably familiar with at least some of those. And if you go and look into any of those writers, particularly Crane, Twain, hard to say those names back to back, Crane and Twain and Harding Davis all published fiction. And they also all worked at various times as journalists. So what critics and scholars have pointed out, and it's pretty obvious really, but these writers used a lot of their techniques and skills honed in journalism to help them write fiction. An eye for detail, that ability to observe, also perhaps a willingness to do research, to learn more about their subjects. A certain ability to let their subjects speak for themselves. We'll kind of see maybe some examples of that in this week's reading. But again, just the basic idea here is that these writers were using tools and strategies that we often associate with literature, with fiction, and they were using that stuff in their journalistic writing. So their journalistic articles and essays often had the sound or the style of fiction, but of course they were intended to be nonfiction, they were factual, they were reportage, they were journalistic, but also literary. So again, this is pretty easy for most people to understand because as the scholars and critics will often point out, we still have a lot of literary journalism. It's still around. We have many modern practitioners of it. We just don't typically use that term anymore. It kind of went out of style in the 20th century. Again, I would argue a lot of things that would have been considered literary journalism in the 1800s would now just be considered examples of creative nonfiction. But we notice, that journalists are obviously documenting things that are happening, right? And particularly back in the 19th century, a lot of those big names that I just mentioned, they were reporting on important, economic, political, and social developments that were going on in the country. But they also happened to be really well-respected writers of various types of literature. So again, they weren't necessarily pigeonholed as being exclusively journalists, right? Journalists back then were often writing other things too. They might have been working in other genres. They might have been producing fiction like Mark Twain did, like Stephen Crane eventually would. And again, we can notice that they're using a lot of the basic elements of fiction, a lot of the basic elements of literature that we've been talking about and that we always talk about in literature class. Stuff like plot, character, dialogue, imagery, theme, right? All of that stuff can also show up in literary journalism. And they're using those tools often to shed light on contemporary events and issues. So some would argue that that is a slight difference, right? The techniques and the strategies between, being used in fiction and this type of journalism are often similar or the same, but some might argue that fiction writers aren't always trying to provide social commentary. They're not always necessarily trying to comment on contemporary issues. They often do. We've seen lots of evidence of fiction writers doing those things, but they don't necessarily have to. Whereas, this group of journalists were often seen as doing that sort of social commentary, providing it through these sort of literary elements. But again, they're using the literary elements to tell true stories about real people, and they're often discussing real issues or problems facing their contemporary society. But we know fiction writers can do the same thing, and often do. Not always, but often. So clearly, there can be a lot of commonalities between these different types of writing, journalism on one hand, fiction on the other. So we already kind of know that. There's a great quote from again, I guess he's been a journalist at various times. He's a practitioner of creative nonfiction. This guy, Tracy Kidder, is pretty well known, or at least he was. He has a great quote that says, these literary elements that we all know, the stuff I just listed, plot, dialogue, imagery, character, those elements never belong to fiction exclusively. Kidder said they never really belonged to fiction. They belonged to storytelling. Right? The point being that all storytellers use those same basic elements, whether they are telling a fictional story or a non-fictional story. So I think most people tend to agree with that now. Again, a lot of these boundaries, a lot of these walls or divisions don't mean as much to readers anymore. These are some of the reasons why, because we can see the overlap and we can see how often journalists are using tools of fiction, and then it can go the other way. We can see how fiction writers might often use the traditional tools of journalism, or even have that background themselves. So we kind of know this, and it set the stage for a lot of future developments in creative nonfiction. So within this tradition of literary journalism, we can place Hunter S. Thompson and Joan Didion, the first two writers featured in this section of our book. So, you guys are probably familiar with Thompson, at least maybe you've heard of him if you've never read him. He's kind of become a bit of a celebrity. I mean, he's passed on now, but he became sort of a pop culture fixture, I would say, for a while, largely because of his book, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which later got turned into a film. He started his writing career as a journalist, as they tell you. This section, starts on page 1015 of our book. So he starts his career as a journalist. He later writes a lot of essays, a lot of what we would typically call today creative nonfiction, but he's always using those tools of journalism. He's a great observer. He often goes to places, meets interesting people, and just sort of writes about it. As they say in the intro, he's often less interested in the events that he's supposed to be covering, and he's more interested in the people, or the people's reactions to the events. So again, this kind of placed him in a little bit of a different category during his career. He was practicing journalism, but it wasn't necessarily a traditional sort of conservative style of journalism that most people would have been more familiar with maybe at the time. Sometimes it's labeled as gonzo journalism. I don't know what that term really means or how many other people it would apply to. It applies to Thompson because he was just kind of a wild and zany guy who also drank a ton and ingested a lot of drugs. So that's kind of part of his, persona, or the sort of pop culture image of him that persists, and people find him to be kind of an interesting figure, in large part because he's this kind of larger than life sort of wild guy. But I would encourage you, when you're reading that excerpt from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and if you live in Nevada, if you're sort of familiar with Circus or other casinos, that passage might be somewhat relevant or, meaningful to you. But as you're reading it, I would encourage you to pay attention to the really high level of descriptive detail that we find. Again, I think Thompson, like a lot of writers who become famous or become sort of pop culture figures, he kind of gets reduced to a stereotype or to sort of an easy to remember sort of persona, and we often just kind of reduce him to the drugs and this sort of wild lifestyle. But he's a very skilled writer, and he has a real eye, a real observational eye, a great eye for detail. But also you might notice, he has this sort of unique perspective, sort of demented or sort of drug induced oftentimes. And again, that often gets a lot of attention and sort of the wild, hijinks and adventures that he gets into. But just notice how he describes the place, how he describes people, how he describes movement, and how he really conveys a sense of place and really depicts the place with a great level of accuracy, detail, but it's also he's departing from certain journalistic sort of traditions or conventions, particularly sort of pertaining to like neutrality, the idea that journalists should be sort of somewhat removed from the action. They should be sort of neutral observers, not really offering their own opinions, but just reporting accurately on what happened. Again, Thompson's not always super interested in that. He's more interested in personalities and experiences, and he's also not really standing on the sideline. He's very much a participant in a lot of the stuff that he's supposed to be covering. Like one of his most famous books, Hell's Angels, he's spending a lot of time with the Hells Angels. He's sort of reporting on them, but he also just becomes friends with them to a certain extent, and he starts to kind of hang out with them socially, but he's also writing about them, and he's writing about that subculture and what it's all about. But he gets very involved, and if you read that book or if you read more about it, you'll see that it actually comes at a bit of a detriment to him. He gets very involved and kind of becomes a dangerous situation eventually for him. But again, that was kind of how some people define gonzo journalism was, they're still reporting, they're still covering things, but they're there in it. They're not standing by trying to maintain neutrality. They're very much in it. They become part of the story. Their own personal experiences become part of the story. And again, some people kind of view that as pretty modern. Like, you might argue that a lot of journalism today sort of functions that way, or at least a lot of what we might classify as creative nonfiction. Again, the events are real, but the techniques are very literary, and the reporter themselves, the journalist, him or herself, might even become sort of a character that we might expect to find in a work of literature that could also define or characterize this sort of type of writing that Thompson helped to popularize. But again, it's important to remember that before he became a well-known essayist, before he wrote books, he was a newspaper reporter. So he always carried some of those techniques and some of those observational sort of tools with him, throughout the remainder of his career. And then if you move ahead after Thompson, you'll see Joan Didion. I sort of left her off the syllabus for some reason. I think that was just an oversight, mistake on my part. We have an excerpt here from a collection of essays that she published called Slouching Towards Bethlehem. Didion can also be placed in this larger tradition of what we might call literary journalism. She didn't work as a traditional journalist for a whole lot of years. I mean, she got her start working for Vogue magazine, and she later went on assignment and sort of did some other journalistic writing, but she was largely a freelancer, and she became well known for writing not only essays, but also novels. She wrote some screenplays. She got sort of involved in Hollywood a little bit. Very well-known writer. She passed away, I think, pretty recently. Won a lot of recognition and awards. Again, considered to be just a master practitioner of what we now consider creative nonfiction. But again, she got her start in journalism. And one of the things that is often discussed with her work is how she maintains this sort of journalistic neutrality. If you read the excerpts here, she's, sort of depicting the counterculture, hippies in the 1960s, sort of demonstrating some of the excesses of that particular subculture. But she's doing it in a way that's very different. Like, she's reporting on it in a way that's very different from Thompson. Didion does not typically insert herself all that much into the stories that she's covering or the people that she's interviewing or the issues that she's discussing. She kind of maintains more of a neutral, distant tone. I would consider her prose to be very elegant, almost effortless. But again, she is using certain literary techniques that we can probably pick up on. I think she's really good at letting her subjects talk. And again, we kind of get this sense that she's in some ways letting events and people speak for themselves rather than offering, summary judgments herself. But very clearly, Didion is practicing a form of social commentary, and I think many would argue that Thompson does too. But Thompson might inject more zany elements, maybe more humor, maybe, more over-the-top elements, a little bit more focused on himself, but still interested in what's going on in society, what's going on with sort of cultural movements, political developments. Didion also is very interested in those things, and it just so happens, like Thompson, she was writing in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. She had a very long career, but she was able to cover a lot of really big, important, sort of momentous things that were happening during those decades. And then later, I believe in the early 80s, she went to El Salvador during some of the worst years of the Civil War that took place in that country. And she was, again, sort of functioning as a journalist. She went there to report on the war. And like Thompson, throughout her career, she published a lot of her essays and articles in magazines and other periodicals. But she ultimately wrote a book about her experiences in El Salvador. I think she went there with her husband, Gregory Dunn, who is also a writer, primarily known for his novels, but I think he wrote screenplays as well. They worked together at times, but they both went to El Salvador. She wrote about her experiences, but it was also just sort of a really in-depth, interesting exploration of the country, a little bit about the history of the country, the background of the war, and also how the war was affecting, sort of regular people, everyday citizens, stuff that a lot of Americans at the time did not know very much about. So that book called Salvador is, one of her more celebrated works, but again, very much a work of journalism based on what she was really there to do. And again, it's all real, right? I mean, all the events, all the people, she's claiming that that's all factual, but the book reads a little bit like literature. It reads like a really good novel. But of course, it's real. It's true. It was actually happening. And for many readers, that's a big part of the appeal, right? I mean, it might seem kind of obvious, but we should acknowledge it and maybe even talk about it more. The fact that some people respond a little bit better to nonfiction than fiction just because something being real might make it resonate a little bit more, or it might make it seem a little bit more significant. All right, so we can move on. Let's talk a little bit about David Foster Wallace. A little bit of a different background. We're kind of moving away from that traditional sense of literary journalism. You could argue that Wallace worked a little bit like a journalist at times. He published essays, he published nonfiction. But what's interesting about him, and they talk about it in the book, is he has a more sort of traditional fiction writing background. And that's another sort of piece of evidence to indicate that these, traditional boundaries between nonfiction and fiction really might not matter a whole lot anymore. But yeah, Wallace really started his career as a fiction writer. He got his MFA. He was writing novels early in his career. His debut novel, Infinite Jest, was really what made him famous. It won him a MacArthur Foundation grant. It put him on the map. But largely what he published after that consisted of essays, consisted of what we would think of as creative nonfiction. They were often about various social or cultural issues. So the excerpt we see here, Consider the Lobster, is very typical of his sort of nonfiction output. So kind of erudite, he was very learned and brilliant, and he often brings a lot of that into his essays. But there's also kind of what we might think of as sort of like a postmodern self-consciousness, a little bit meta at times. He's also interested in a lot of arcane subjects, as they mention in the book, and he does a lot of research. He did a lot of research on whatever topic or subject he happened to be pursuing. And he had a lot of other sort of academic interests. Again, his background was creative writing. That's what he studied. That's largely what he taught. He was a college professor for most of his his adult life and career. But he was also very interested in philosophy, psychology. I think some of that shows up in our reading this week. And again, like Didion and like Thompson, he often wrote for periodicals. Like they mentioned, Consider the Lobster was originally an article that appeared, or at least it was like commissioned by Gourmet magazine. I'm not exactly sure if it ever appeared there or if he published it elsewhere, but it was originally an assignment for Gourmet magazine that got him writing about lobsters and the way that chefs kill lobsters in order to prepare them, obviously for diners. So he wrote for magazines, he wrote for periodicals, but he's also well known for his novels, for his fictional work. Infinite Jest, and then also The Pale King, which I believe was published posthumously. But clearly, Wallace, his style, which isn't necessarily for everyone, like I find that people usually have pretty strong opinions about Wallace one way or another. You either really like his style or you might really dislike it. But that style, again, kind of self-conscious, very sort of intellectual, but also interested in maybe some lowbrow stuff as well. Again, kind of known for mixing high culture and low, a sort of self-conscious, intellectual tone, but also a lot of humor, satire, that certain postmodern self-consciousness, like that whole package. It shows up in his fiction, and it also animates his nonfiction. So a lot of scholars and critics, again, point to him as a good example of someone who, was using a lot of the same tools, a lot of the same strategies, whether he was producing novels or essays, and again, kind of blurring the lines between these different types of writing. And again, later in his career, he really increasingly turned to essays. He never stopped writing fiction, but he wrote probably more essays. He published more essays than he published fiction. But he took that fiction background and put it to good use when he was writing these explorations of various topics. So again, we can notice that what he's doing might seem a bit different from what Thompson and Didion are doing. Again, Thompson and Didion are coming from sort of a journalistic base. They are reporting on specific events. I mean, Thompson's at least, he's in Las Vegas for, I can't remember what the actual thing is that he was supposed to be covering. I think it was like a motorcycle race or like some kind of convention, but he was there on an assignment. But, of course, he got sidetracked and ended up doing all these other things. But, he's there to report on something. Didion is reporting on something, right? The counterculture, sort of hippie culture in San Francisco in the late 60s. So they're kind of working from this traditional sort of journalistic foundation, but they are departing from that tradition in various ways. I think we can see that what Wallace is doing might just strike us as kind of a modern form of the essay. It doesn't really feel like a newspaper article. It might not feel like traditional journalism. What it is really is just an essay of commentary. We might call it social commentary. We might think the interest is a little bit more psychological, but it's a different kind of format. He's not really reporting on a specific event or person. He's just exploring a phenomenon. He's exploring a concept, or he's exploring a set of related ideas and experiences that he thinks might be important, and he's going to draw conclusions and deliver some kind of meaning from it. So again, we see a lot of this in contemporary writing. It might not really be a newspaper article. It's not a short story. It's not a novel. It's an essay, maybe somewhat similar to the essays you might find in an academic context, but it's not necessarily academic writing. Instead, it's tapping in to stuff that matters to the society, to the culture, stuff that might be connected to economics, history, social science. there's really no hard and fast rules. It's just stuff that matters to people. But again, think about the prose. How is the prose written? Is it going to be dry? Is it going to be academic? Is it going to be super neutral? No, not necessarily in a lot of cases. There's going to be more of a literary style, a more engaging style designed to deliver whatever that larger meaning or message might be. So we can see that definitely with the Wallace excerpt. And then finally, we can finish up with Alison Bechdel, who's writing a graphic novel. And I thought we should spend a little bit of time talking about graphic novels, or we could sort of expand the category, talk about comics more generally. Different people have different definitions or classifications for those types of writing. So I'll use the term graphic novel, but we can also observe that Bechdel, wrote comic strips before she hit it big with Fun Home, which we're reading an excerpt from in the book. But I wanted to give at least a little bit of coverage to graphic novels because they are obviously very popular today. The graphic novel genre or category, however we want to define it, has really become quite prominent, quite respected, not only popular, but sort of critically acclaimed and acknowledged as being largely on equal footing with a lot of other traditional forms of literature when it comes to sort of level of complexity, the quality of the writing, the thematic material, the range of possibilities when it comes to thematic material, the ways that these texts can engage with people and deliver meaning. So again, like we were talking about with genre fiction weeks ago, there was certainly a time, and it wasn't that long ago, when comics or anything perceived as looking like a comic would have been regarded as inferior to novels or short stories or poetry or plays. But you guys don't need me to tell you that we don't necessarily think that way anymore, at least not most readers. Graphic novels are very popular and they are critically acclaimed. So a couple things to point out, and they talk about some of this in the book, but again, they kind of credit Bechdel along with some other writers of her sort of era as helping to usher in what we might call the modern graphic novel as we know it today. Again, it hasn't really been around that long, certainly not as long as these older literary forms, but by the early 2000s, we started to have a vocabulary, we started to have more of a sense that, graphic novels or comics were ascendant, and they were doing more than just, some of the stereotypical sort of perceptions of them, like, oh, they're just about superheroes, or they're just really targeted for a younger audience, an adolescent or teenage audience. Again, those were, misconceptions, prejudices that many scholars and critics held for a long time. We might argue, again, up until about 20 years ago, maybe even more recently in some cases. But a lot of those stereotypes have gone away because we've had more and more work like what we see in Fun Home. Thematically, in terms of also like character development, like what we're getting here is very comparable to what we would get in one of those old traditional social realist novels that we were talking about at the very beginning of the semester. So in some ways, what writers like Vonnegut and Kerouac were talking about in the 50s is still kind of operative here, right? This idea that in order to achieve meaning, in order to, provide something meaningful to readers, you don't have to use that old kind of, stuffy, high-minded, sort of highly literary style. Again, like we've been saying, that kind of falls out of fashion. And even people working within the traditional novel form wanted to find new ways of expression. They wanted to freshen up the novel, right? That's what we began the semester really talking about. How do we make the novel relevant at the end of the 20th century? Well, we have to tap into people's real lives, and that means maybe departing from those old formats that were really designed for older generations, previous modes of living. So inserting jazz or rock and roll, making the prose a little bit less formal, trying to make it sound more like regular people speak. All of that stuff, but also just finding new ways to connect to readers, just that basic idea that some of those thinkers were kind of wrestling with, we see that sort of play out. We almost could kind of consider graphic novels to be part of the fruition, sort of the finish line to that journey, incorporating images, as a lot of scholars have shown, kind of this interplay between images and text. On one hand, it's very accessible to readers. Like, readers just like it. It's fun to read. It's often pretty easy to read. And that's great. But at the same time, it's creating sort of a new literacy. It's creating new effects that had not previously been tapped into with the old social realism that we all have to study, and the old stuff from the 19th century or early 20th. So in a lot of ways, this is just kind of a further progression of what some of the earlier writers this semester were trying to do. But yeah, this incorporation of images obviously gives us new things to consider in a sort of whole, it's just like a brand new terrain, really, to explore. But yeah, critics have pointed out that there's this interesting effect with graphic novels. There's no separation between form and meaning. And this is an interesting concept to explore because, again, it's a way to differentiate graphic novels a little bit, but it's also a way to see them as perhaps doing more or more effective work in certain ways compared to earlier forms of literature. So the idea is, with older forms of lit, we could usually talk about content on one hand, and then we could sort of talk about style on the other, right? We could talk about prose style, what types of figurative language was the author using, word choice, sentence structure. That's all kind of on the level of style or form. And then there was always like the thematic level, or what we could consider the level of meaning. Like, what's the book actually trying to say? Like, what's the message? What's the moral? What's the theme? That sort of split is very common when studying novels or short stories or even poems. We can talk about stylistic features on one hand, and then we can talk about the thematic material on the other. And we can always observe how the style impacts or influences the delivery of the theme, but we can often, perceive those two levels as being somewhat separate. But with graphic novels, there really is no separation between form and meaning, right? It's inseparable. The content, the actual sort of thematic content of a text is inseparable from how the author chooses to depict the story, right? Because we have this combination of picture and text. So the idea is kind of like every formal detail that you see in a graphic novel will contribute directly to character development and the larger theme at work. So some critics would argue that makes analyzing a graphic novel a little bit different from analyzing a poem or a novel. Because, again, there's this interplay between the image and the words, and you can't really separate. You can't separate them. You can't separate the text into those two old departments or old categories of style and content, or form and meaning. In a graphic novel, the form is the meaning. That you can't separate them. You have to deal with them as sort of a package, a sort of combined package. And there's also, again, this idea that on one hand, graphic novels are perhaps easier to consume in some ways. And, we don't have to make apologies or excuses for that. That's fine, right? If we're talking about how a genre or a particular text can connect to audiences or, do real work in the world, like we were saying weeks ago with that sort of old division between literary fiction and genre fiction, one thing that scholars have made clear by now is that genre fiction, more pop stuff, almost always has a bigger impact because it reaches a wider audience and it's more accessible to more people. So yeah, the high literature, the high culture, high art might have some important meaning to communicate, but it's never going to affect as much change. It's never going to impact as many people simply because it's more exclusive. It's maybe a little bit more elitist, frankly, or at least that's been the history, and it's just not getting out there to as many viewers or readers or consumers. So we can see how graphic novels are easy to consume, they're fun. A lot of adults who grew up reading comic books, comics that might have been sort of more geared towards a younger audience, they can make an easy transition from the comic books of their youth to graphic novels intended for adults because the form is remaining largely the same and they're already conversant in the language, the vocabulary of this particular type of writing. So on one hand, yes, very accessible, very popular, easy to consume, but at the same time, as readers are consuming it, they're also developing, like I said, kind of a new literacy. Because this new literacy, and we might even sort of liken it to like a digital literacy, which I think most people now possess, but it's this ability to just like process a lot of information at once. And just like a lot of what we consume on the internet, a lot of what we are reading or looking at will be a combination of written text and visual images. So the idea that we have to sort of make sense of both, we have to analyze both, but we have to analyze how they're working together to create something new. A lot of scholars say, yeah, graphic novels are helping in that development. They're sort of helping us to develop these new literacies, but also just the online nature of life today, I think, is also contributing to some of these new literacies, these sort of new ways of consuming media. And it's not always strictly reading on a page, but a lot of new media, a lot of what we see online, again, it's this like hybrid. It's like hybrid text. Lots of written text, also images. There also could be, audio elements. You might be listening to certain things, watching certain things, not always the exact same as reading in the traditional sense of, sitting down with a book where there's nothing but text on the page. But again, we can think about overlap. We can think about how these new types of media, these new types of texts are delivering a lot of the same kind of thematic material, a lot of the same level of character development, plot progression. Again, these same literary elements that we would expect to find in a novel, they're also operating here in this sort of new type of novel. So the meaning, the ability to express meaning might not be changing, but now we have different techniques, different modes, different media, and of course, considering images always gives us more to do and more to analyze. But one more thing to mention with Fun Home, just another sort of interesting consideration of genre. So they mention in the book that really what Bechdel is doing would be considered more of a memoir and not so much autobiography. And I think this is interesting to consider, like the difference between these genres. They're sometimes conflated, they're sometimes thought to be the same, but they're actually not. They're both sort of similar, right? I mean, they belong to the same general category of writing about oneself, but they are a little bit different in the sense that autobiographies are generally considered to tell a complete life story, right? They, again, are sort of novelistic in terms of scope, or at least if we're thinking of like the old sort of classic, long, epic, or social realist novel. But yeah, they span an entire lifetime, or at least a large chunk of a person's lifetime, whereas a memoir is more featured, it's more focused on a particular turning point or touchstone in the author's life. So it's not really purporting to cover the entire life. It's just more of like a chapter or an episode in that life. Or maybe just a period of time, like their 20s, right? Their high school years, whatever. And that's really more what Bechdel is doing here, sort of capturing a certain period of her life, which was very significant, in which, many important things happen, turning points that would affect her for the rest of her life, but she's not telling her entire life story. She's instead focusing on some particular moments, a particular stretch of time. But another thing that they point out about her writing is how she often cites famous literary writers from earlier generations. She has a lot of allusions with an A, right? Bringing in a lot of references to other writers, other texts, other influences. And as we've seen throughout the semester, that's kind of a postmodern move. A lot of postmodern writers do that. They like to sort of wear their influences on their sleeves. But again, that's significant here because though it might seem a little bit silly to us, that particular characteristic helped to grant some credibility to Bechdel's writing, and this was true of other graphic novelists as well. If critics and scholars noticed that they were alluding to James Joyce or F. Scott Fitzgerald or Marcel Proust, these really important literary figures from earlier generations, if scholars saw that in graphic novels, they would be more likely to say, oh, well, maybe this graphic novel is doing something interesting. Again, we've maybe moved away from it a little bit now, but part of the way that graphic novels were able to kind of break into the mainstream was by getting recognition for their use of literary elements. Same with literary journalism. It became celebrated once those elements sort of got identified, and it was like, oh, look, this kind of reads like traditional literature, but it's different. It's something new. It's a new kind of journalism. It's a new kind of essay, or it's a new kind of comic. But it's doing a lot of stuff that we recognize. It's using a lot of these traditional literary elements that we know and love. So again, that granted credibility to the genre, to the form. And it doesn't really have to prove itself anymore in 2023, but it did go through a process where it kind of had to get legitimized by a lot of the gatekeepers and, cultural tastemakers of literature. And largely that was done, again, through this recognition of, hey, they're referencing a lot of other literature. They're using the tools and strategies of literature to accomplish these new things, to create these new forms. And eventually it catches on. Again, it always catches on with popular audiences first, and then critics and scholars usually come along a little bit later to sort of study and analyze the work. All right, so I think that's mostly what I wanted to cover this week. I would encourage you guys, though, to think about modern examples of these different sort of categories or groups of creative nonfiction, because I would imagine that most of us have read some creative nonfiction either for a class or maybe just for pleasure. So think a little bit first about literary journalism. Have you come across work by journalists, work that would be considered reportage, nonfiction, but sounded and read like literature? Have you read some essays that are a little bit like what we see from David Foster Wallace? And then finally, what's your experience with comics or graphic novels? Have you read some? What are some that you're a fan of? And how do you see those texts sort of doing work in the world? So I'll post a few of those questions for this week's discussion. And then, like I said, we're kind of moving away from the book, at least briefly. I mean, not entirely. You want to ultimately choose a text from the book to write your final paper on. But for the next couple of weeks, I want us to really get moving on our papers, our research. So after this week, we don't have any more reading assignments. We don't have any more required readings on a weekly basis. You're, of course, welcome to read more stuff if you want. If you're interested in something that I have not assigned and you're thinking you might want to write about it, or at least you want to read it and then decide if you want to write about it, feel free. But there's no more reading assignments beyond week 12. So once you finish up with these texts and this week's discussion, let's get moving on the paper. And that's what my final lecture will be about next week. So get in touch with me if you have questions, and otherwise I will see you next week.